Hi everyone, I'm Katherine and welcome back to my channel. So as you can see, I have no shortage of handmade skirts in my wardrobe, but I do have a serious shortage of shirts to wear with those skirts. It's really gotten to be quite sad. So I decided it was time to order some linen from my favorite Canadian linen web shop called Pure Linen Envy and make some linen shirts. I used only 1 yard of fabric for each of these shirts and a self-drafted pattern. So if this sounds interesting to you, then keep on watching. Okay, so first we're going to talk all about how I made this beautiful golden colored linen shirt, which is a very simple, loose fitting shirt that's meant to be tucked into one of my skirts, and it has these cute flared short sleeves. So first let's talk all about the patterning. This shirt was made from a self-drafted pattern that I made years ago really, and I always really liked this shirt. It was very versatile. I wore it quite a bit, but I only had one of it and I decided it was time to make some more. The beautiful thing about this shirt is that it's perfect for a beginner pattern drafter to draft themselves or a beginner sewer to sew themselves. It's really quite simple. So when it comes to the patterning, I use my favorite drafting book, Metric Pattern Cutting, which at the very beginning has instructions on how to draft both a close-fitting bodice block and a loose-fitting bodice block. So I'd already drafted these years and years ago, so I used the loose-fitting bodice block as my base for this pattern, and the only alteration I made to it was simply to rotate the dart to an underarm position and to widen and lower the neckline a little bit. When it comes to making the flared sleeves, all you have to do is take a basic sleeve pattern, cut it off at the length that you want it to be. So in my case, it was sort of a short length. And then you slash and spread and add triangular flare in between each of the sections that you slashed open. And then you tape it down onto a new piece of paper. That's it. That's all I did to make this pattern. So if this process sounds interesting to you, but you're still quite confused about how to go about this, but you would like to try it, then I highly recommend getting yourself a copy of Metric Pattern Cutting by Winifred Aldrich. It's a great beginner pattern drafting book, and it's really the only pattern drafting book you'll ever need. I also have a video called All About Pattern Drafting if you're more interested in this topic. So as I mentioned, I did make this pattern years ago, and after wearing it, there were a couple changes I wanted to make. Mainly, I just wanted to shorten the darts a little bit so it just creates more of a looser blousey fit. And I also made the shirt a little bit longer so it's easier to stay tucked into a skirt. And I also made the sleeves just a little bit longer. Okay, so I was ready to cut out my pattern out of my 1 yard of linen fabric. So I started with fabric that had been pre-washed and pressed flat, and I had it folded in half on my cutting mat. So this particular pattern didn't include seam allowance, so I simply added it as I went pretty much by eye because this shirt is so simple that it has a lot more margin for error when it comes to seam allowance. So the original version of this shirt that I made years ago was fully lined. It was made from a very thin cotton voile, so I just made a fully lined version of it. But with this shirt, I just wanted it to be a very quick project with only 1 layer of fabric. So I only cut out just 1 layer for the front, 1 layer for the back, and then instead of doing a neckline facing like I would normally do to finish a neckline, I decided I would make some matching bias tape to finish the neckline with in a much quicker, simpler way. I cut out 1 front piece on fold, and then I cut out 2 separate back pieces so there would be a center back seam, and of course 1 of each sleeve. And then I cut out my bias strips of fabric that I would later use to make my bias tape with. This bias tape would also come in very handy for the next shirt project, so stay tuned for that part. Okay, so now let's talk about sewing this shirt. This shirt is really a perfect quick sewing project if you are a nap time sewer like I am. I sewed almost this entire shirt in one of my kids' nap times, so it was definitely a successful quick project. I started by sewing up my front darts, and the way I like to do this is by first obviously marking the placement of my darts, which I already did during the cutting phase. And then I like to baste them together using a ladder stitch across each leg of the dart until you get to the very point, and then you pull your threads tight and it closes up the dart for you, and creates a handy basting line that you can follow as a guide visually when you're stitching it at your machine. I like to sew my dart starting at the wide end of the dart and going towards the point. And as I get towards the point, I gradually reduce my stitch length until it's almost as small as it can be. And for the last inch or so of the dart, as I'm getting to that point, I sew pretty much right along the fold of the fabric. This is a technique that I actually learned from YouTube a few years ago, and I've always found that it makes perfectly smooth darts. Then I sewed the side seams and the shoulder seams, and normally I would use French seams for this, but this time I decided I would try some felled seams because I like the look of felled seams with shirts. So this involves sewing the seam to the outside of the shirt, pressing it open, trimming one of those raw edges down, and then using the other raw edge to fold over that raw edge that we trimmed. I would press that down and then sew it at my machine. Felled seams are obviously a great way to finish edges of seams if you don't have a serger or you don't feel like using a zigzag stitch. And it's also a very durable seam and it has a nice look to it, especially for shirts. I also sewed the side seams of the sleeves in this way, and then it was time to insert the sleeves into the bodice. So I first added a hand basting stitch around the sleeve head. This is called an ease stitch, and you use this stitch to just gently pull on the threads, just gently, very loosely gathering up the fabric. And this won't create gathers in the finished shirt, but what this will do is just help you to fit the steep curve of the sleeve into the armhole without it bunching up and causing wrinkles that you don't want when you're sewing it. So again, I stitched these seams to the outside of the bodice and then I felled it. A word of warning, if you're new to flat felling seams or new to sewing in general, I wouldn't recommend attempting to flat fell sleeve seams because it was definitely tricky, and I would recommend something like, well, obviously a zigzag stitch to finish the edges, or if that's not available to you or you'd rather not use that, then French seams I think are easier to do on sleeves than felled seams. So now it's time to finish the neckline. So I used my bias tape that I made using one of my bias tape makers, and I pinned it to the outside of the neckline, right side to right side, and stitched along that edge. Then I pressed it and flipped it over to the inside of the shirt and then stitched down the other side of the bias tape on the inside of the shirt. So this way, all you see from the outside of the shirt is just a stitching line, so it almost looks like the neckline was hemmed. And on the inside, you see a nice strip of bias tape. So I just think it adds a nice finish to the inside. Now, of course, another option for finishing a neckline with bias tape is to have a visible bias tape edging, which would mean that you would first trim off the seam allowance of the neckline and just fold it over that edge like a trim. So then I just sewed a basic rolled hem for the bottom of the shirt, and the final step was hemming the sleeves. But this is a little more tricky because the bottom of these sleeves, since they're so flared, it's very curved. It's almost like hemming a circle skirt or something. And so the way to do this is you have to first sew a basting stitch around the edge of the sleeve, so within the seam allowance, and then you gently pull up on those threads while you're pinning or clipping the hem in place. And what this does is it just helps gently gather all that excess from the curve in a way so that it won't cause any folds or bunches in the fabric when you're hemming it. This was actually my first time trying this technique. I'd heard about it for a long time, but I was always too lazy to try it. But it worked really well and it didn't add very much extra work at all. Okay, so this shirt was done and it was definitely a success. I already love this shirt. I've already worn it a lot. It goes well with my silk taffeta circle skirt that I recently made using the same technique from my how to make a circle skirt video. And I just really love the shape of it. I think this shirt is so versatile, especially to wear tucked in with skirts, or if you have high-waisted pants that you want to tuck it into. It just creates a very nice flattering shape, but it has that loose blousey effect on top without a lot of work on your part with patterning and sewing. And I also love the look of flared sleeves. I think it definitely adds a lot to any shirt to have some flair in the sleeve. So again, this project is great for you if you're new to pattern drafting or if you're new to sewing. And by the way, you don't have to know how to draft your own patterns to make this kind of shirt. If you just have a pattern in your pattern stash that's a loose fitting bodice, you can just easily use that and adapt it to make this pattern. And I definitely recommend trying it out. Okay, so now we're going to talk all about how I made my collared blouse, again using a self-drafted pattern and only 1 yard of linen fabric. And this is of course the shirt that I'm wearing right now. Now this is a pattern that from a shirt that I've actually made in a previous video about. It's one of my older videos called hand sewn 1 yard blouse or something to that effect. I will link it. I always really loved this pattern, but it was made at the very beginning of my last pregnancy. So I was a lot smaller. I mean, not a lot smaller, but I was probably my smallest body size at that time when I made this. So now I can just squeeze it on myself, but it's kind of tight, especially at the waist because it is a fitted waist on this blouse. So I decided I would remake it and just give myself a little more room in the waist and make a couple other changes that I wanted to make to the pattern. So let's jump into the patterning stage of this video. I'm not going to go into a lot of how I made the original pattern because that is on my previous video, so definitely check that out if you're interested in that. But when it comes to the changes I made to the pattern, I'm going to get into that right now. So as I mentioned, the main thing was I needed to make the waistband a bit larger. So I added, I forget how much I added. It was probably 1 or 2 inches of size to the waist. And then I also added a bit of size in the body panels so they could still have that nice gathered blousey effect when they're gathered onto the waistband. I also lowered the line of the yoke a bit because I just thought it would look a bit nicer if it was just a little lower than it was on the original blouse. And I liked the overall shape of the collar in the first blouse, but I thought it would look nicer if it was a little larger, so I added a bit of extra size to the collar. And finally, when it comes to the sleeves, I always found that on this blouse, the armholes came up way too high and were a bit too constricting. So I lowered the armholes a bit and adjusted the sleeve accordingly. Oh, and one more thing to mention about the collar is that when I made this original blouse, it was my very first time ever making a collar, and I didn't quite fully understand how to draft a good collar in the sense that it didn't sit flat against my body. I actually had to use hand stitches to hold it down against the shirt. And in an ideal world, collars are just supposed to naturally sit flat against your body. And so I did alter the collar to do that. The way you do that is you basically just slash the collar pattern a bit and you overlap it a little bit at the outside of the collar circumference, and that just helps it sit flat against the body. Okay, so it's time to cut out this pattern. So this pattern already had a seam allowance included, so it was a bit more straightforward to cut out than my gold colored shirt. But the main issue was that this pattern obviously has a lot more components, a lot more pattern pieces than my gold colored shirt. So it definitely required a little more finagling to fit it all onto my 1 yard of fabric. And in an ideal world, this shirt would have been able to not have any back seam. It would have just been one back piece for the yoke, the body piece, and the waistband, but I actually have a center back seam in all of the back pieces, including even the waistband, which definitely doesn't look the best, but it was literally the only way I could fit all these pattern pieces onto the fabric. I don't think anyone else is going to really notice. Now also in an ideal world, I would have had enough fabric left over to cut both a top layer for the collar and a bottom layer. But as you can tell, I didn't have enough, so I used scraps from my breastfeeding dress project, which I recently made. I will link that somewhere. And I think it's okay because it doesn't show from the top and it just kind of adds some more visual interest, so whatever. Okay, so now let's talk about the sewing of this blouse. So I think this was the #1 improvement in this version of the blouse compared to the first time I made it. The first time I made it, I used French seams. This time I used flat felled seams, and I really think that takes this shirt to the next level to actually looking like a dress shirt, because if you've ever looked at dress shirts, pretty much all of them have flat felled seams, and that's part of what gives them that dress shirt look. And I really love how the seams turned out, especially the yoke seam with the flat felled seam and the visible stitching. I really like how it turned out. So that would be my #1 tip to you if you're trying to make a blouse or a shirt, something with that little more dressy look, to use flat felled seams sewn to the outside of the garment, because it just really gives it that look. So this shirt was a lot more complicated to put together than the last shirt, so it did take me a little longer, but that's okay. I started by just gradually piecing together the separate components. So First the yoke, I sewed the side seams, the shoulder seams, and then the body panels, I sewed the side seams of that and the center back seam as well. And then the waistband, I pieced all the waistband pieces together as well. And then the collar, so I had two separate collars, the top layer and the bottom layer. So I sewed those seams together as well. And again, I used flat felled seams for all of these except for the collar. The collar was just basic seams because obviously the seams are concealed on the inside. So the way I constructed the collar, once the side seams were all sewn, I was able to sew the top layer and the bottom layer together. So I did right sides together, sewed along the outside edge of the collar, so this edge right here, and then I trimmed down my seam allowances and clipped it because obviously the seam is very curved and so you need to clip into it to allow it to lie flat. And then I turned it right side out and pressed it. And finally, I top stitched very closely to the edge. Top stitching was definitely essential for this collar because it helped conceal the fact that the underlayer is a different color by just holding everything nice and flat together. By this point, I had sewn the side seams of the sleeves as well with flat felled seams. And it was time to attach the sleeves into the yoke armholes. So I added hand ease stitches around the sleeve head, pulled up on the threads, pinned it in place, and sewed around that. Now with this particular seam, I kind of forgot what I was doing and I sewed the seam to the inside rather than the outside. So I simply ended up felling the seam, but on the inside of the garment. So all you can see is the line of stitching. You can't see the actual felled seam on the outside, but that's okay. Now it's time to add the body panels to the yoke. And the body panels were much wider than the yoke, so they required a gathering stitch to be added into the top, gathered up, and then pinned to the yoke. So I sewed this in place with the seam to the outside of the garment, felled this seam. And in this case, it was important that the side of the seam edge that was folded over to create the felled seam was the side from the yoke, not from the body, because the body seam was very gathered and ruffled up, and that would simply not work for a flat felled seam. I could not attach the collar to the yoke until the waistband and the button placket were all in place, because the button placket is what helps create the final circumference of the neckline to fit into the collar. So it was time now to construct my waistband and my button plackets. At this point, they were simply strips of fabric. So I took them to my ironing board. In the case of the waistband, I just pressed it in half lengthwise, and then I pressed each edge under. But I did something that would make my job a little easier in the sewing stage, which is that I pressed one of the raw edges under a little bit more than the other edge, meaning that when they come together, one of the edges sticks up a little bit higher than the other edge. And this would come in very handy later in the sewing stage. I did the exact same process with the button plackets, except that I first basted in a strip of scrap fabric inside of the button placket just to add some extra reinforcement for the buttons and the buttonholes. So after gathering up the bottom of the body panels with a hand stitch, just like I did at the top, it was time to add it to the waistband. So I pinned it in place. Attach the waistband in 2 passes. So I first sewed the front edge of the waistband to the shirt, the bottom of the shirt, pressed it, and then brought up the back edge to the inside of the shirt. And I stitched that in place by machine, but I did it from the front, so that from the front it simply looks like a top stitch, but in the back it's holding that back side of the waistband in place. And so the back side of the waistband is the side that stands up a little bit taller, and the reason for that is just to make sure that the top stitch would catch that edge in place. An alternate option for doing this is simply sewing it in place by hand, which is what I always used to do, but now I just find the machine method. I'm more comfortable with it, and obviously it saves me time. So I used a similar process now to attach the button plackets, and these button plackets go all the way from the top all the way down to the very bottom of the shirt, except that I attached the button plackets all in one pass. So I just clipped them, I pinned them in place, and then I sewed it from the front so that from the front it looks like a top stitch going down, but it's also holding that back edge in place. And again, the back or the inside edge of the button placket is the side that's sticking out a little bit further, just to make sure that it gets caught in that top stitching. Okay, so now that the button plackets were in place, I could finally add my collar. This was the part that I'd been waiting for. So it took me a little time to kind of conceptualize how I was going to pin it in place, like right side to wrong side or wrong side to wrong side, like how do you do this? But I eventually figured it out. And in this shirt, I decided to use a method I've never used before, which is where you conceal the raw edges on the inside using a strip of bias tape. And this is where that extra bias tape from my gold colored shirt came in handy, because I didn't have any extra blue linen to make bias tape with. I think the gold colored bias tape just adds a nice visual pop of interest on the inside, and it doesn't show from the outside. So I figured out how to pin the collar in place. You basically pin it in place sitting exactly the way it will sit in the final blouse. But then I also pinned the bias tape into this seam, side facing against the collar. And so I sewed this seam, again catching the bias tape in the seam, and then I pressed it and I turned the bias tape under to the inside of the shirt. Also, obviously I clipped down the seam allowance of all the blue fabric, the collar and the shirt, and then I stitched down the other side of the bias tape so that all that's visible from the outside is just this seam, and it's hidden under the collar. And then on the inside, the bias tape nicely hides the raw edges. I absolutely love how this collar turned out and how the bias tape finish turned out. Okay, so the final step was finishing the bottoms of my sleeves. So I wanted these to be puffed sleeves, which means I had to first add a gathering stitch to the bottom of each sleeve, pull up on those threads to gather it up. And normally puff sleeves would have a little cuff on the bottom to hold them in that gathered up position, but obviously I didn't have enough extra fabric to do that. So I again used extra gold colored bias tape from my shirt project, and I sewed that in the same way that I finished the neckline on my gold colored blouse. So I kind of used it as a facing. So I just sewed the bias tape right side to right side against the bottom edge of the shirt, and then turned it under to the inside of the sleeve and sewed that in place. So all that's visible is just this stitching line on the bottom. Now the final step was adding my buttonholes. I definitely wasn't looking forward to this process, because in the past I've always just done my buttonholes by hand, because I have my modern machine which does them, but usually it's down in my basement and I'm just too lazy to bring it up and set it all up. I did decide to use my machine just to save time. But the first step, of course, was marking the placement of my buttonholes. So I used the folded paper strip method, where you have a paper strip the length of your button placket, and you just keep folding in half and folding in half until you have enough folds along the paper to indicate how many buttons you're going to have, and then you use those fold lines as a guide for where to mark the placement of your buttonholes. I found some nice little white buttons in my stash that were pretty small, so these buttonholes were only about 1 centimeter wide. So I also marked the width of each buttonhole with a mechanical pencil, so it was nice and accurate. And then I took this to my modern Janome machine and stitched my buttonholes. And finally, I hand sewed my buttonholes in place. I use a method where you have a toothpick on the inside of the shirt to hold your stitches a bit loosely, and then you pull the toothpick out and you add some buttonhole stitches around that loop of threads, and that kind of creates a thread button shank, if you will. So it just helps the button be able to rotate more without breaking all the threads. And this shirt was done. I'm very happy with how it turned out. I love this kind of shirt because it's so great to wear with skirts because it's short, but it's fitted at the waist, but it still has that blousey effect. And I'm definitely going to be wearing this a lot. Okay guys, that's all from me for this video. So if you enjoyed it, please give it a like, leave your comments and questions below. Check out the accompanying blog post, which will have more making details in the description below. I also have a newsletter that you can sign up for on my blog. All my social media links are in the description. And thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you soon. Bye!